Hi, I'm Bishop Brian Marsh, the Bishop Ordinary of the Diocese of the Northeast of the Anglican Church in America. And began my term as Bishop Ordinary on January 1st, 2009, and I expect to retire at the end of this year, December 31st, 2022, which will make it 14 calendar years, I guess, complete. Which is, I believe, the longest, or certainly one of the longest tenures of any diocesan bishop in the Diocese of the Northeast. My two predecessors, Bishop Bruce Chamberlain and Bishop George Langberg, were excellent leaders, and I'm very pleased to have served as their successor.
How would you characterize your tenure as bishop? What would you say your leadership style is?
Well, I think it's been collaborative. I think it really has to be. Bishops really should never make decisions, except for fairly routine matters, in isolation. So it's absolutely essential that a bishop have a very good team of clergy and lay leaders to depend on. And I've been incredibly fortunate. God has been very good to send to the church both a very strong staff, the chancellor, the secretary, the treasurer of the diocese, some excellent lay and clerical members of the standing committee. I have an absolutely superb bishop coadjutor who has served now for over 5 years. And also some excellent priests, rectors, priests in charge of many of our parishes. And whenever a serious decision needs to be made, I've had to rely on the consultation, the advice and counsel of the Standing Committee, the advice and counsel of several of the clerical leaders and lay leaders. So it's been a very fortunate episcopate in that way, because we have some superb lay and clerical leaders in this diocese.
In your 14 years as bishop, what have been some of the memorable moments, if you will?
Well, I think there have been many, certainly ordinations, confirmations, which were always a highlight. Probably some of the most important in terms of the church have been the ecumenical work that we have done. For example, the signing of the Communio and Sacris agreement between 4 continuing church bodies in 2017 had to have been a highlight, because it brought together 4 continuing churches, jurisdictions. And in the history of the continuing church, which dates back to 1976-77, at the Denver consecrations of 4 bishops which were consecrated to serve the continuing church. But in the interim period for almost 40 years, there was a great deal of friction between the continuing church jurisdictions, which prevented not only the preaching of the gospel, because everyone was kind of doing these little feudal warfare situations, and it also prevented any mutual cooperation. So for the past 10 or 12 years, we have worked very closely to bring the Anglican world together, and we certainly were successful in doing that in the USA, and now we are expanding that to a worldwide ecumenical movement to bring all Anglicans, all traditional Anglicans together. That has to have been the highlight. I think in some ways too, the solidifying of the diocese in terms of the health of most of our parishes. We have really emphasized bringing quality clergy into the diocese, and we've also emphasized the high degree of cooperation and collegiality among the clergy. I think these are some highlights. I'm very pleased, as I mentioned earlier, to have worked with the high quality of clergy that we have, and we've really strengthened many of our parishes by also teaching effectively, I believe, the faith, and also emphasizing not only the strong ministry of the clergy, but also a strong ministry of the laity. When the clergy fulfill their ministry at a high quality, and the laity fulfill their ministry, different ministries, both, but when they work collaboratively to exercise those ministries, healthy churches result. And that's been a very important part of our ministry for the last 14 years.
I noticed that you mentioned the continuing church in describing those 4 different jurisdictions. Can you expound on that a little bit?
The continuing Anglican churches began during the liberalization of the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion, of which the Episcopal Church is a part, in the 60s and 70s. And with the ordination of women, the departure from traditional morality and the teaching of the biblical faith, the traditional faith, there was a strong movement to break apart, to leave the Episcopal Church, to leave the Anglican Communion, and to continue the teachings of the Church as they had been delivered to us. And that is how the idea for the continuing church was formed. Hundreds, thousands of individuals joined together to form the various continuing church bodies. And at one time there were, of the major continuing church bodies, there were probably 8 or 9. We have now consolidated many of those, and we're working together. But the continuing church was really formed to maintain the faith once delivered to the saints, and I think we have successfully done that. One thing I should mention is that at the consecrations of the bishops, there was an earlier document called the Affirmation of St. Louis. That's a seminal document in the history of the continuing church, and it's something that every continuing Anglican should be familiar with. It maintains the faith, and it emphasizes the important moral and theological points that the continuing Anglican Church subscribes to. And most continuing Anglicans do subscribe to that in a jurisdictional sense, to the Affirmation of St. Louis. So it's a remarkable document.
So as you've been bishop over these last 14 years, the culture and society has definitely been transitioning further and further away from biblical values and viewpoints. How did you shepherd in those times?
There are 2 points I would first of all emphasize. I think the departure of the culture, the culture is going in some, certainly many would consider, rather strange directions. The church is all the more important at such times. It's important that we have the health that the Christian church in its traditional Anglican formularies brings to people. It's something that we can stand on. It's something that we can maintain, something that we can affirm. And it produces healthy Christians and healthy individuals to have that solid, biblical, faithful teaching. That's the first and important point there. Plus, it's also a very necessary thing to belong to healthy communities, because it is within the community that we find our true identity. God has given us each an individuality, given us each gifts, and it's through a healthy Christian community that we can emphasize and use those gifts, and also to become part of a greater whole. It's an important thing. It's a necessary thing, given the 14 years that I've served and the 30 years of total ministry that I've had, to really see how that has happened. I see many healthy people that are in our parishes because of the teaching, because of the worship, and because of the presence of Jesus in all that we do.
I'm sure over the 30 years you've been in ministry and the 14 years as bishop, you've had a lot of learning moments, a lot of times when you could reflect upon. Are there any that are favorite for you as you look back?
That's really an excellent question. I think the learning goes on pretty much on a daily basis. People who have have come to me for counseling, for something, I oftentimes learn from them as well. It constantly amazes me how the wisdom of the church can be communicated not only by one individual, not only by the bishop, but by parishioners, by children, by other clergy. That's one reason why a healthy church is a church that is constantly discussing things, considering what is God's will for us at this particular time. And that's something that I pray for daily, is not only the wisdom, but also for the wisdom of the collaborative unit, which is a healthy Christian diocese and church. And that is probably the biggest lesson, and it's a lesson that I learn over and over again when I work with people. There are some individual clergy and lay members of the diocese that I call on a fairly regular basis. What is your perspective on this? And the answer and the decision emerges from the body of Christ in prayer, seeking to make a decision that is of God. That's the biggest lesson that I believe any bishop or any Christian can learn.
I've been around some of the last 4 years of your leadership, and one of the characteristics that I've noticed is that you find common ground with people, that you unify bodies to take 4 completely different jurisdictions and to help them find common ground is a remarkable accomplishment. What advice would you give future leaders of the church?
Don't make any decision that is going to harm anybody. God doesn't want any of his children or any of his people to be injured at all. And that's one of the lessons that we learned first in our deliberations. And we, the 4 who were most involved in the coming together of the Communion and Sacrament Agreement, is that we would make no decision that was harmful to any of our jurisdictions or any of our people. And that is one of the reasons why the Communion and Sacrament Agreement was so successful, is that we made that decision early on. Part of that was something that we wrote, it's probably now 8 or 9 years ago. We wrote something called the Affirmation of Interjurisdictional Integrity, which meant that we would do nothing to harm another jurisdiction. In other words, we wouldn't attempt to steal clergy or steal churches, but we would work to cooperate. And one can only negotiate in a position of trust. And if you trust another individual not to harm another individual jurisdiction or individual, not to harm you, but to look for a way forward that was mutually supportive and of God's will, that's where progress is made, and that's where we come together. And one of the things that I would also emphasize is that we are not distracted by issues of what's come to be called gender politics or women's ordination or same-sex unions. Those things are off the table and allow us to preach the gospel faithfully without being distracted from our mission by extraneous or secular political realities.
You mentioned some of the secular challenges that are affecting the modern church and our culture today. As you're sort of finishing out your assignment as a bishop and you're transferring and transitioning that leadership to another person, what do you see as some of the challenges they'll be facing in their tenure?
One of the things is growth, and also to get the word out that this is a not only a wonderful traditional jurisdiction, but it is a safe and healthy place with which to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. One of the things that probably I have learned, although I came in with the understanding that it's important to have an effective transition between leaders, whether that's parish leaders or perhaps bishops, it's important to be able to make that transition effectively. One of the problems that many parishes have in the past faced is the rather abrupt termination of leaders where parishioners could not, for example, say goodbye and therefore could not effectively welcome an incoming clergyman, whether that was a priest or a bishop. We've been very fortunate in this diocese in that we've had very effective transitions between the episcopal leadership. And that produces a very strong sense of safety and stability in the diocese. And I'm very, very proud, justifiably proud of the fact that we are and will make a very effective transition.
So my last thought or question would be, who has had the greatest influence on you as a bishop?
Well, I would have to say that probably my predecessors, Bishop George Langberg and Bishop Bruce Chamberlain, both of whom were very different individuals in a lot of ways, but they obviously loved the church, and they did their best to grow it, to bring in effective clergy, and also taught me that it's not an easy thing to be a bishop. 25 or so years ago, I asked Bishop Chamberlain a very silly question. I said, "What's it like being a bishop?" Well, it's really kind of a silly, basic question, but he took it very seriously, and he answered me very honestly. He said, "Well, it was a lot easier being a parish priest. When you're a bishop, you're pulled in all sorts of directions, and you carry a heavy burden. It can be a very joyful ministry, but it is also a ministry that requires the full being of a man who is called to that office, and it is not without its serious decisions that need to be made." So I think they influenced me greatly. Also, my brothers in the G4 jurisdiction, Bishop Walter Grundorf, Archbishop Mark Haviland, Bishop Paul Hewitt. I have learned a great deal from them just by the very nature of our collaborative work. I've rarely had a work relationship that has been so productive and so collegial and so prayerful. It's been a remarkable journey in that regard. My successor, Bishop Hendy Webb, has also worked extremely collaboratively with me over the past 5 or 6 years. I think it's brother bishops, but it's also clergy as well, and there have been many. The church certainly does provide mentors, there's no question about it, but one of the best mentoring processes is actually living within the context of a healthy Christian community, because one becomes aware that even though I have a unique ministry as a bishop, everyone has their own ministry in their own unique ways, because they each bring gifts to the church. So it's a humbling experience to recognize that. The episcopate does require that the man who is the bishop must exercise a certain authority, but that authority is always mitigated through the body of Christ, and that's a very exciting thing, particularly when you have such the real gift of having served this wonderful diocese.
I know that as you step down from your tenure as bishop, you're not going to step away from ministry completely. What are your future plans?
Well, I have been asked to stay on as the ecumenical officer in both the Anglican Church in America and the traditional Anglican Church. And so I will be attending ecumenical meetings and making recommendations to Archbishop Jansen, who's the primate of the traditional Anglican Church, and Archbishop Juan Garcia, who is the presiding bishop of the Anglican Church in America. And so I will be serving as their emissaries, if you will, to all of the ecumenical meetings. I also plan to produce a number of religious dramas, chancel dramas, films, and publications that address a variety of issues. In fact, at our upcoming synod, we will be presenting After Damascus, which is a story of St. Paul after Damascus, his Damascus experience, his conversion experience, and right up to the present. So we're going to bring St. Paul out, and he's going to be right there present today. And he's going to talk about his conversion, and he's actually going to deliver an epistle to each parish or place that he visits. So for example, he will, at the end of the presentation at our Diocesan Synod in October 2022, he will present an epistle to the Diocese of the Northeast Synodians. So that's what will be. So we'll have not only fun with that, but it should be hopefully a very illuminating experience of actually meeting St. Paul in person.
That sounds exciting, very creative, almost full circle for you.
Indeed it is, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for taking the time to sit down and talk with us. We wish you well and Godspeed.
Thank you very much, Father Brad. It's been a pleasure.